right, so continuing our lesson here for lesson 67, the first part here from Wednesday, we just finished up with some questions about when it says to give all of the answers. When it says to give all of the answers, you do have to include either that plus 360n if you're giving the answer in degrees, or you have to include the plus 2 pi n if you're giving your answer in radian format. You can just follow the directions in your textbook as to which format they want you to give. Now, we do not always want to give all of the answers in our questions, so we're going to have to see how do we correctly define our inverse trig questions by restricting the domains. Now, the word domain in math means the x's. The x's that we're going to use on this question is not like the x for the cosine, it's the x for like the answer that we're going to give on our question. So we want to restrict, or we want to limit, where can we give these answers to. That way we can't do all of the answers on this question. Now, something that you should already have on your circle, and if you don't have this on your circle yet, on that great circle, then please make sure that you do go ahead and add this right now here for me. We had talked about in our trig lesson before about different signs in the quadrant, whether things were positive or whether things were negative. We had noted in that top right-hand quadrant, which was the first quadrant, all of our ratios were going to be positive. Notice our signs, all of those y's are positive. All of the x's, all of the cosines are positives, and positive divided by positive is a positive. So sine, cosine, and tangent were all positive in quadrant number 1. Well, what was true about quadrant number 2? Only the sine was the one that was positive in that quadrant. So make sure you do have on your circle here, in that second quadrant, which is the top left-hand quadrant, sine is the one that's the positive answer. If you look at all of those y's, there are positives, all of the x's are negatives, and involving a negative on division meant that tangent was negative as well. In the third quadrant, only tangent is the one that's positive. Negative divided by negative gave me positive down in the third in the bottom left-hand quadrant. Then in the fourth, the cosine was the one that was positive. Remember kind of the way that I used to remember these. I mean, I just got to remember the first is where everything's positive, but second starts with S. Sine starts with S. That's the one that's positive. Third starts with T, tangent, which also starts with T, is positive, and it kind of breaks down for the fourth quadrant, but cosine is the only one that I haven't used so far in my question. Well, if I need to restrict, if I need to limit the answers I'm going to give, because all of these means I would even give 2 answers, because sine is positive in the first, and it's also positive in the second. Well, I might just want to give 1 answer and not 2 answers in our question. Today, we're going to look at the possibility where I can give just 1 answer, and then tomorrow we'll see how could I possibly give 2 answers on our question. So let's go ahead and start off with our sine questions. Now, please make notice, because this is a big difference between these questions today and between the questions tomorrow. This letter S is a capital letter S. Anytime it's a capital letter question, that's going to restrict how many answers you can give. A capital letter question is only going to have 1 and only 1 answer in our question. Tomorrow's questions would be a little letter s for the inverse, and that's going to give us 2 possible answers. But anytime I see a capital letter, whether it's the S for sine, C for cosine, or T for tangent, I'm only going to be giving 1 answer on this question. Okay, so let's go ahead and mark this on our circle. For the inverse sign, for the capital letter, you're going to be restricted quadrants 1 and quadrant 4. Quadrant 1 in that top right hand, and then quadrant 4 in the bottom right hand side of your circle. Now, how do I know which one I'm using? Make sure you get this down as well. In quadrant number 1 is where you're going to go if the ratio is positive for your sign. Quadrant number 4 is where you're going to go if the ratios are negative on your question. Okay, so quadrant 1 included all the positives for capital sine inverse. Quadrant 4 includes all of the negatives for your capital sine inverse. So that means my answers should fall in between negative 90 degrees and positive 90 degrees. If you look at your circle, positive 90 degrees is up here at the top of the circle, going straight up past quadrant number 1. And then rotating the other way down into quadrant number 4 first is where I go into negative angles, so I hit at negative 90. So my answer has to stay on the right-hand side of our paper when it comes to our sine inverse question. Let's go ahead and look at the other 2, then we'll work through a couple examples together. So let's see what it is for cosine. Again, please make note here that's a capital letter C. Capital letter questions are restricted to one and only one answer. What are the restrictions when it comes to a cosine question? It's quadrants 1 and quadrant 2. So make sure you write that on your circle. Quadrant 1 is where you're going to go if you have a positive ratio that's given to you in the question. Quadrant 2 is where you're going to go if the ratio that's given to you is a negative answer on the question. So that means my answers would stay in between 0 degrees and 180 degrees. On the right-hand side of our circle is 0 degrees. There's quadrant 1, there's quadrant 2. So when I stop at quadrant 2, I hit 180 degrees. So my answers for a capital letter cosine question are always going to come from the top-hand side of our circle. Quadrant 1, if the ratio is positive. Quadrant 2, if the ratio given to me is a negative ratio in our question. Let's look at our last one for tangent. Again, capital letter T. Capital letter questions have a restriction. We only are going to give one answer in our question. The restrictions for tangent are the same as they were for capital sine. They're restricted to quadrants 1 and quadrant 4. Quadrant 1, you're going to go to if your ratio is a positive ratio. Quadrant 4, you're going to go to if your ratio is a negative ratio on your question. All right, so that means my answer is going to fall again between negative 90 and positive 90, just like it did for the sine question. So what's the similarity between all of the ones that we just marked down? Quadrant 1 was used in all three of our capital letter questions, because in quadrant 1, everything is always positive. So capital letter questions for positive ratios, the answer is always located up in quadrant number 1. Your sine and your tangent were the ones that were the same. Their negative answers are going to restrict you into quadrant number 4, and then cosine's the oddball. Its negative ratios go over to quadrant number 2. I have 3 different questions that we'll walk through together, and hopefully this will make sense to you as we're looking at these examples. So my job, it says to find each inverse trig function value that exists. Notice that's value that's singular, which means there's one answer that I'm going to give on this question. I also know that this is going to be a one answer question because the problem that's given to me where it says sine inverse is a capital letter S. Anytime I see a capital letter question, I only have one answer on this question. Well, what did we just mark down for sine, for capital letters? A capital letter sine question was either quadrant 1 or quadrant 4. Well, quadrant 1 is where things are positive. Quadrant 4 is where we put things if they were negative. Well, how do I know which one I'm doing? If I look at this ratio, root 3 over 2, well, is that positive or is that negative? Root 3 over 2 is a positive ratio. So where was capital sine positive? It was in quadrant number 1. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at my circle now, and I'm going to see, okay, in quadrant number 1, in this top hand section, where do I see sine, which is the letter Y? Where do I see an angle that gives me a sine of root 3 over 2? If I look at that, I locate it at 60 degrees. Now, these answers, just like they will in the textbook, are going to say give your answers in degrees and also give your answers in radians, and the circle does that for us. 60 degrees is the same thing as pi over 3, and there is our final answer on this question. Okay, so just to make sure we understand, if the question would have said that I had negative root 3 over 2 for my ratio, okay, if there's would have been a negative sign right here on the root 3, well, that meant, okay, capital letter sine is one quadrant. I only can give one final answer when it's a capital letter question. Well, sine is either 1, quadrant 1, where things are positive, or 4, where things are negative. If I look at the fourth quadrant, where do I see a sine that's negative root 3 over 2? That's located at 300 degrees. Now, I actually would not say 300 degrees on my question, because remember, the answers were supposed to fall between negative 90 and positive 90. So if my answer has to be into the fourth quadrant, I'm going to rotate down, which means I would give a negative answer on the question. I would say negative 60 degrees or negative pi over 3. So anytime you do land in the fourth quadrant, make sure that you just put a negative in front of the kind of like the reference angle that we talked about before. Don't give me the actual angle like 300 or 315 that's sitting down there in quadrant number 4. Okay, I have 2 more examples. Let's try working through these together. So our next one, capital cosine inverse negative 1/2. Okay, so again, capital letter, that makes a huge difference. Capital letter questions have one and only one answer. What was the restriction for a capital letter cosine? Well, it was either quadrant 1, which meant I had a positive ratio, or it was quadrant 2, which meant I had a negative ratio. How do I know which one I have for this question? If I take a look at the ratio, is the 1/2 positive or negative? Well, I can see it's a negative. So where is capital cosine negative that was restricted to quadrant number 2? So let's go ahead and take a look at our circle. Where do I see cosine, which is the x, that gives me a negative 1/2 in the second quadrant? Well, what angle does that correspond with? 120 degrees. The radian measurement is 2 pi over 3, and I've given both of the answers on this question. So second quadrant, I just give the exact answer that the picture tells me. It's only in the fourth quadrant where I have to do like that negative answer like I just showed you on the previous question. All right, last example. Capital cosine inverse 2. Okay, so let's think through the question. Capital cosine, a capital letter question, I already know has one and only one answer. Cosine, what were the limitations? It was either quadrant 1 if it was positive, quadrant 2 if it was negative. So let me take a look at the number. The number is 2. That 2 is a positive 2. Well, positive 2 means I would be in quadrant number 1 because that's where the restriction was for a capital cosine for positives, quadrant number 1. So if I look at my circle in quadrant number 1, what angle has a cosine, which is the x of 2? None of them. Okay, I see a half, root 2 over 2, and root 3 over 2. I don't have an angle over there in quadrant number 1 with a cosine of 2, so there is no answer on this question. If you were to look at the circle, kind of all of the answers for cosine, all of the answers stay in between -1 and +1 for the ratio. So when they give me this 2 or even like a -2, that can't exist inside of our circle. The same thing's true for sine. All of the ratios are in that fraction format. Nothing's above 1, nothing's below a -1 in the question. So the key, capital letter questions, one and only one answer. Capital sine, quadrant 1 if you're positive, quadrant 4 if you're negative. Capital cosine, quadrant 1 if you're positive, quadrant 2 if you're negative. Capital tangent, quadrant 1 if you're positive, quadrant 4 if you're negative.